Okay, we're recording now.
Recording.
Oh, Mercy, do you mind muting your mic? I think my voice keeps echoing.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for Mercy is here. Thank you for joining, and for those who will be watching the recording, thanks for watching. This is week 3 of our Webflow workshop sessions. Let me pull up what we will be covering today. So for today, this right here. For today, we're going to be covering global styles. So for typography, for colors, for spacing, etc. How to set up global styles in Webflow, and how to update them. We're also going to cover how to name classes for scalability and reusability. We're going to cover creating a style guide for consistency. And then last but not least, I'll briefly introduce Finsweet's client first methodology. And this is a system for naming your layers in Webflow, but it's one among many systems. So I won't go into it into much detail, but it's just for me to introduce you guys to it. And then the idea is that you do your own research and kind of learn it on your own since it takes a bit more time. So let me open up Webflow. Um, okay. So here is where we are. Week 3. If we remember week 2, we did cover. Wait a minute, why is this? Let's see. In week 2, we covered how to build a simple layout in Webflow. We did Flex, we did Grid, and we practiced essentially building out this very simple hero section layout. So the homework was to rebuild something like this, and just to practice how to build in Webflow. So I don't know, Mercy, if you did this or if you have any questions or wanted me to look at what you did since you're the only one here, or if you're good.
No, I wasn't able to do this, but I did the first version. This
Okay.
not yet, yeah.
Okay, no worries. This is more like taking your time. So when you get time to do these things, then that's when you should do them. But if you, one thing I actually forgot to mention in previous weeks is if you guys do these workouts and you want to send them to me by email or on WhatsApp for me to look at them, you can. I know Doreen did, and I realized, oh, actually, yeah, if you guys want to do that, that'll be fine. So I can look through what you did and give you any feedback if you'd like in the middle of the week. You don't have to wait until, Friday or Sunday. So going into week 3, as I mentioned, we'll start with global styles. So in Webflow, if we go to our style panel on the right, we can see we have a lot of different style components here. So we have the layout styles, which we have already looked at in the past 2 weeks. We have sizing styles, so width, height, etc. Positioning, typography, backgrounds, borders, effects, and then their custom properties at the end. So these are like your main style components that you use. And they usually are enough for you to build essentially anything in Webflow. But for the super, super unique or like custom things you might want to build, there's always custom code that you can incorporate into your project. So when we talk about global styles, essentially what we are referring to is our variables. So these are styles that we save within our Webflow project that we can use throughout the project on every page. And the idea is that as we continue to use them, if you ever need to go back and make changes to them, it's extremely easy to do so because they're saved as variable. They're called variables. They're saved as variables within Webflow. So when you open up your variable tab and it's here on your left, you'll see that there's base collection and nothing else. This is the default. You can add and import collections as well, or import shared libraries. I haven't done this yet, but you can import shared libraries, or you can also share. For example, if you create your own library of variables and you want to share it with someone else, you can then share it. We can't share ours because we haven't added anything in it yet. So that's a feature. But if you want to also add a new collection, you can do so through here, or the easiest thing is to just go into your base collection and open that. So once you open that, you'll see that there are no variables here. So there's nothing that we've added. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into new variable. When you click new variable, you'll see that you have a few options of like what variables you can add. So there's color, there's size, there's percentage, there's number, and there's font family. The ones that I normally use are color and size, and like maybe font family sometimes. But I don't need to cover all of them for you to understand how to use them. So we'll just cover color and size. The others work similarly in how you would use them and adapt them to your project. So let's say color. Now, this kind of goes hand in hand with understanding how to build your style guide, which I'll cover after this. But if you're familiar with style guides or you've worked with them in Figma or in any design tool, you'll kind of see how you build your variables is similar to that. So with color, if you just create a default color, it opens up, it will be called color, and the value is white. So this is a white color. Now, the cool thing about variables is that you can create categories and subcategories, which makes it easier to then manage your variables. If you have like maybe five, it's not that important. Like for example, let's just build a couple of variables. Like let's call this red and we'll make it red. Let's say this is yellow, yellow, um, blue, and you don't have to actually type the color. You can also click the actual square and then choose a color or even add in the values here. So let's say that's our blue and we'll, oops, set it closely. And then we'll have green. I'll just write green. And then for the last one, we'll say like maybe purple and I'll just write purple. So we've already created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables here. And if I actually go back, let me create a random square. Uh, let me call it button. Because we use our button class in the other page. So for example, button, right now we put a custom, value here. We just clicked the square and then we added a random color to it. Oh, actually, I think the best way to illustrate this is to use this as a reference. So going back to the exercise that we did last week, I'll use that to illustrate how the variables work. So we have our button, which is purple, and we just randomly picked this purple color. Now, if we wanted to link this to, one of our variables that we've created, when you hover over this space, you'll notice this purple icon with a plus. You click it and then it opens up your variables. So once it opens up your variables, if you have a lot, you can search for variables. Like maybe I'm looking for red, but if you just have a few, then it's just easy. You can scroll through your list. So in this instance, maybe I no longer want my button to be purple. I want my button to be blue. So I select that and automatically it has changed the color of my button to match the blue variable I've saved in my project. Now, if you want to disconnect anything that's connected to your variables, you can either click on it and then click this unlink icon here. That'll disconnect it. So now it's no longer linked to your variable. It's just a normal color. You can also edit this here. If you want to, for example, change the variable shade, you don't always have to go back to your variables. You can do so right here. So you can change the name and you can change the value. Now, if I go back to my variables, and let's say I don't like the shade of blue and I want to change it to make it more like turquoisey, less more like green, like maybe something like this. So a light blue. So now I've changed it. And if I go back, I'll notice that it's also changed in my button. This is just to show how useful variables are in the sense that if you have a project with maybe 5, 10 pages and you're using like 3 key colors throughout those different pages, it is very difficult to manually set colors. Like I'll manually set the shade of blue, I'll manually set the shade of black. If later on you decide you want to actually change that color, you have to then individually go to every single place you've used that color and then update it there. However, if you're using variables, it doesn't matter how many times you've used this color on your website, as long as it's linked to the variable. If you go into your variable and you edit it, it'll update throughout your entire project. And that's what makes variables so useful because it allows you to make quick style changes to your project without having to take so much time individually updating elements. So if we go back to our variables, um, we have these 1, 2, 3, 5 colors, 5 shades. But I mentioned also that when you have fewer variables, then it's not necessarily, you don't have to categorize them because they're just 5 colors. That's easy enough to manage. But if we imagine we had like 20 plus or hundreds of variables, which is very possible depending on how complex your project is, then you might want to consider categorizing them. So The way that you categorize in Webflow is um, you go here where I typed in red, and right before red, this is how I like to categorize them. I have primary and I have secondary colors. So these are my primary colors. So for all of these, I'm going to write primary, and then you add the slash, the backslash icon, and you click enter. Now you'll notice that it's moved to this particular color down here under this category called primary, which I can rename if I want. So it doesn't have the primary um, word before red anymore because it's already categorized it under primary here. Now, if I want to do, for the others, I can do the same thing. I can write primary slash purple and it'll automatically move them. Or I think you can also just drag and move them this way and it should do the same thing. So I've dragged and I've dropped, and so all my colors are now under primary. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a new variable, and I want these to be my secondary colors. So I write secondary slash icon red. So these are now the same colors I have for primary, but these are the secondary versions, which maybe are just, the lighter versions. Like this red should be a bit lighter. Then you have purple, which should be, a lighter shade of purple. Oh, that's like more pink. Maybe like that. And then we'll do the green, a lighter shade of green. We'll do the blue. I'll make this dark again. So then we can have the lighter shade of blue here. And then we'll do yellow, the lighter shade of yellow. So now I have my primary colors, the 5 shades, and then I also have my secondary colors. If I go back to my page and I click this, so if you want to change to a different variable, you just click this. I can see that I have now my primary colors here and my secondary colors, and I can click any of them in order to apply that specific color to my button. So if I want my button to be purple, I'll just click that. If I want it to be light purple, etc. And right now I'm using like background color as an example of where you can use these color variables, but you can use them anywhere in which you would apply colors. So you can use them in background color, you can use them in text color. Like if I want to make this a light purple or a red or a blue or something, I can use it here. You can use it in box shadows because you apply colors in box shadows. So essentially anywhere in your style panel where you can apply a color, you can then link it to your color variables. So now this is color. Just undo that text color. But as I mentioned, there are different variables that you can use at Webflow. So there's size, percentage number, and font family. Size, if I click onto that, um, allows you to set different styles, different sizes within Webflow. I don't use it a lot because of just how I work, but there are ways that you can incorporate also style sizing in Webflow if it's convenient for your project. So if I leave this as size and I click here, you can see there I can write my number, if my size is in pixels, or if it's in EM, RAM, etc., all these other units of measurements, and you can save it that way. So let's say, for example, we want to set a default size, and our default size will be 24 pixels. So 24 pixels is our default size. If I go back, is conveniently named also default, I can now link this specific class to my default size, which is 24 pixels. So when I select that, now I can see here that my size by default is 24 pixels, and I've linked it to this specific text. And then I can unlink it by just clicking it and then selecting disconnect if I really want to, or just undoing. So in the same way that you link colors by, selecting this purple icon, it also applies to size. Anywhere where you see that you can apply size, here, width, height, even padding, margin, quite literally anywhere where you see that you can apply a size is where you can link it to a size variable. Going back to our variables, the other thing I also forgot to mention is that you can also link variables to each other. So for example, right, I have these colors, primary, secondary, and I want to now create a new group. And this group isn't going to be named primary, secondary. Maybe we'll say that this group is named according to a specific function. Like I have my button colors. So like I'll say button primary, but as you know, normally in a website, you have like maybe a primary button, a secondary button, called inverted button, if we're like dark screens versus white screens, whatever you want to call it. So we have these three different types of buttons. Now I can go in and add a color to this, or because I already know the colors I'm using here are going to be one of my main colors. Because these are like the main colors of my project, therefore these are the main colors I'm going to use. So rather than just copying these codes and using them here, you can go in and you can actually select this icon and then link it to an existing color. So for example, I want my primary button color to be purple. So I link it to purple. And then I want my secondary button color to be blue. So I link it to my blue shade here. And then for inverted, so like maybe on like dark screens, I want it to be this light purple. So if we go back to our button here, we can see right now we've linked it to purple. But now that we have our button group or button class, we can actually link it directly to, button, because this is a specific group that we've created for our button. So we can link that to a primary, secondary, inverted, etc. And so now it's linked to that, which means if we were to go back to our collection, and let's say we are changing the shade of purple, we are using like a slightly different shade of purple. So I'm going to change that and then leave it. We made it a bit darker. You can see when you go back to our button, it's updated because we are directly referencing this shade here. So anytime we change this shade, it'll update here. Or if we change the blue here, it'll also update here. If we change the light purple we've used here, it'll update here. So that's the other really great thing about variables, the fact that you can link them to each other to make it easy to build more complex styles. So up until this point, I don't know, Mercy, do you have any questions? Oh, during to any questions, you guys, before I move on?
Yes, I do. I do have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I saw like you can link the colors with the button. Can we
Mm-hmm.
also like on this variable like creating the whole button and then instead of just like linking the style, I mean the size, the colors, maybe the font, and then be like the whole button? Is it possible on the variable?
So for example, like this button, I've linked the
Yeah.
color. Let's see if you can also link like the font, right?
Uh,
And then, yeah, you can also link, we didn't add any fonts. Like, let's say, let's just create one.
yeah.
Mhm. You can also link it to the font. So you can link all font, size, and color to this one button. Yeah, it's possible.
Okay, and is it working the same way like we can have a design system and then attach to this, like the same design system work on Figma? Is it possible?
What do you mean? Like the way you build a design system in Figma, if you can also build that
Yeah,
same on Webflow?
yeah.
I think so. I haven't built a design system in Figma in a long time, so I don't know how different it is, but I do think it's possible to a certain extent. The only thing I think is also maybe for more complex things that Figma can do, in Webflow, you might need a plugin to help them do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No, on my side.
Okay, great. So these are quick overview of variables. And like I said, there are others, there's size. I mean, we did size a bit. There's percentage, there's numbers, there's font family. So you can explore those. Also Webflow itself, they have like courses and videos on everything. So if there's something I don't cover in much detail in this lesson, you can still go and I'll try and also link them in the email. You can read more or like listen to more information about these topics through the Webflow videos too. So I think the easiest thing to do now is to actually see how we can create a style guide in Webflow now that we've covered global styles. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to open up a new page. And I normally use a style guide template for style guides. For my style guide because it's the same every single time and it's much easier to use a template and then edit the components in the template than to build from scratch. So the one that I use is this client first clonable. This is from Reloom. I can also send the link in today's email. So you just open that. Let me actually show how to get that. Okay. So if you search, actually, I'll include this link in the email. If you look up Room Style Guide on Google, or you can do so by the link I'll be sharing, you'll see it'll open this. This is the Room Style Guide. It has some info, blah, blah, blah. And then if you want to copy that so that you can be using it in your own Webflow projects, you can just click Clone in Webflow. It'll then take you to another page where you confirm you want to like create a duplicate of this in Webflow. And then that way you can access it in your dashboard. So once it's in your dashboard, you can actually open up the project and you'll see here there's like this intro page, which you don't really need. What you do want to do is open up your pages, and then here where it says draft or style guide, this is what you're actually looking for. So when you open this, you'll see that this has a lot. I mean, this has padding, this has containers, this has headings, um, paragraph styles, text styles, buttons, colors, etc., etc., etc. And what I normally do is I will select this entire page wrapper, and if I go back to my project, I will create a new page on my project, and I normally just call it style guide, and I click create. Once that's created, I just click my body and I click paste because I already copied my style guide from before. And it'll paste that for me. So now you have your style guide in your project, which means you can manipulate it and do whatever you need to do with it. So with this specific style guide that I use, although there are a lot of different examples, so you can also look up different ones if you'd like. The only thing I edit here are starting from headings. So the text. I don't edit these at all because I don't need to. I normally use the same styling in my own projects. So like, for example, there's padding medium, there's padding small, there's padding global. Looks a bit confusing looking at it like this, but this is just trying to give you a visual understanding of like, okay, what does this all mean? When you actually apply it to your projects is when it's easier to understand how you'd use these different classes. But for the time being, just ignore them and we'll start from our heading classes. So once I have my style guide open, you can then click into, for example, your headings and then make whatever edits you want. Another thing I wanted to point out is that you see here there are two headings. There's H1 and then there's heading. So H1 is like the default HTML heading class, which is why when you click it, it doesn't have a class or a tag because it is this specific tag applies to all H1 headings. You can even see here it's called an HTML tag. So if you want to update these, and this is just for headings, well, not just for headings, but this is the specific instances for headings. How you edit is by clicking this text and then clicking here where it says style selector, and then you can click all H2 headings. So this will edit all H2 headings you use throughout your page globally in your project. So then I can change this to, whatever it is that I want to do. If you just click it and then make edits without doing that, you'll see it creates a new class, which isn't what you want. You don't want to create a new class. You want to actually edit all the headings that apply with this tag. So all H1 headings. How do you then reuse or kind of get these headings again? Once you add in a heading element in your project, you'll see that there are different tag options. So H6, H5, H2, H1, etc. So that's how you choose those different ones. So we can edit our H2, H1 headings as tags, but also you can sometimes, and maybe we'll cover this in a future lesson, for accessibility reasons, how you build your page is the first heading on your page in your hero section should be H1, because that's the first heading. Two, heading 3, heading 4, in like a descending structure. And that's supposed to be better for SEO and better for accessibility reasons. However, sometimes you might, depending on the design of your project, you want to use a smaller text, but the size that you've used for that specific heading, like by default, is too large. So in that case, you can then use these actual heading classes. So for example, in this case, or let me actually say in this case, oops. in this case, I could say this is actually supposed to be head H1 on my project because this is the first heading I have on my page. But I actually want the size to be smaller. I want the size to be the same size I'm using for H3. So how do I do that? I add my heading and I make sure I still select H1 because that's what I'm supposed to do. But then in my class, I can go ahead and give it a class of heading style H3 so that I make sure I get that specific sizing that I want. So that's why you have these two different heading styles for all 6 headings. Going down, we also have like paragraphs, link styles. Once again, with paragraphs, you'll see when we select this, you can like there's no class applied to it, and they've actually given you an indicator through the colors. So you'll see pink basically means this is an HTML tag. So when you click this style selector, you can select all paragraphs, and then that will allow you to make changes to this specific sizing. So all of these are HTML tags, and you can edit them by clicking and then selecting the HTML tag for a all ordered list. This doesn't mean that you can't apply classes because sometimes there are unique situations. Like for example, you have 3 different kinds of link styles you want, you can still go in and give it an actual class name in order to differentiate. But this is just if you want to make a global changes to these different elements. So those are like paragraphs or HTML tags, as I call them. And then we have text classes. This is going back to, I think I mentioned week 2, you sometimes have different sizes for your text size large, size medium, etc. And then these are like different other kinds of text styles you can use, like all caps, link. The more you familiarize yourself with the style guide, the easier it is to like remember that all of this is in here. But once you do a couple of projects, you know this by heart. You like know exactly what's in here and it's easy to reference. So these are all classes. You can see they're blue. So they're all classes that we've used. You notice this says button 2 instead of button. That's because we had already created a button in Webflow. When you copy something from another project to your project, it can have the same class name. So they'll usually just change the class name. And then you have colors, you have background colors. So like I mentioned, we already have our variables. So if we wanted to link these to our variables instead of, what they're linked to currently, we can go ahead and do that. Like if I want this to be my shade of blue or my shade of, red, I can just link that directly to my variable. And it's as easy as that. Then there are a bunch more classes. The easiest way, though, that I think it is to understand how to use all of this is to actually apply it. You can obviously go through this page and familiarize yourself with what is in here. But now that we have our style guide, it is much easier to then go in and actually build out our project. So, oh, before I do that, the other thing I wanted to mention was the style guide is if you go into so this project, the starter project. I went in and I opened their variables. So this is how they've laid out their variables. I wanted to show an example of what it would look like if you had a lot more variables in your project. And these are all color based actually. I don't think there are any sizing ones. So they have like their base colors, which are, these shades. Then they have their base color neutral, which is one I'd recommend using. It's just like all shades of like white, black, and gray can be very useful for any project. Then they have their base color system. They have their background color shades, which as you notice are already linked to previous variables. They have border colors, they have link colors, they have text colors. So they've laid all of that out and then linked them to previously created variables. So this is just an example of how you would, you might structure a more complex so it doesn't actually have any sizes or anything like that. How you would, if you wanted to like duplicate this exactly, in your dashboard, you can just go in and actually duplicate the project, and then that'll allow you to get all these collections. Variable, sorry. So if I go back to my week 3, as I mentioned, the best way to understand how to use these style guides and to use these colors and to use these global styles is to actually practice how we're using them. And at the same time as I'm doing this, I'm also going to try and explain client first methodology or the client first system. So the client first system, I don't know if there's like okay, there is. So I will probably also link this in the email, but it is a way in which that you can set up your project and name your layers in Webflow. I mean, according to them, it's the most used use this system. I don't know if that's changed now because there are other systems that are incredibly popular as well. But this is the one I've been using for since I started learning Webflow. Although I actually do want to learn others because it's good to compare and see which one works best. And you might find that certain systems work better for different projects. So it's good to know maybe at least one or two. But this is the one that I know as of now. So they have a lot of information on their page where you can actually learn how to use this system. Although I will say it's not easy. I think it's a lot initially to like understand. And time I've been on it, which was like 2 years ago. So it might be a lot easier to learn and understand how to use this system, but I haven't actually used their new guides yet. I was using the old ones before. So I'll try and explain like the basics of client first as we go along, and then you can continue to practice how to use it in your own projects. The key thing to remember is it doesn't have to be perfect because this is still new for a lot of you, but it's more about getting into a system of understanding what are the best practices when it comes to naming my layers. And I do encourage you to explore other, frameworks. I'll link them in my email, the other ones that I know, to see maybe if there's an easier one for you that you might want to learn. So, last time we did a hero section. So for today, let's say we want to design, gosh, I don't know, like what's a popular thing that we can design. Let's say we want to design a footer, because why not? Well, we're going to design a footer. So you'll notice that the first thing I've added is a div block and I've called it page wrapper. So this is a client first thing where this is like your container that holds in all the content of your page, hence it's called page wrapper. It's a class that's already made. Now that we've copied our style guide, we have a lot of different classes that came with it. So you'll notice like when you even open up your class panel and you type in anything, there's a lot of different classes that are now existing in your project. So page wrapper is one of them. So this is your main wrapper that contains all your content. Now that we've created page wrapper, let's say we have, you know, a navigation. I'll just leave this as the default navigation. This is our default navigation. And then you normally have another div block, which is called main wrapper. Whoops. And it already exists. Main wrapper is essentially the content that goes in here is all your sections, all your containers, etc. Basically everything except your navigation and your footer. This is your main wrapper. It's the main body of content, hence why it's called main wrapper. So you have your page wrapper, which has everything. Then you have your navigation nav bar, and then your footer. Oops, just create another class called footer. And then in the middle, you have your main wrapper, which is all your body content. So we don't have anything in our main wrapper right now. It's just showing this to explain how you layer these different div blocks. But we're going to be focusing on the footer section in particular. So you notice I named it footer section. That's another thing with client first or just naming conventions in general. And I think I talked about this last week as well. It's good to get in the practice of name giving detail to your layer name. So this is footer section, not just footer. In the same way, I would call this nav, like navigation section. So we have our footer section, and then within our footer section, I believe last week we just automatically went in and started adding stuff, which is, yeah, I mean, it's not bad, but it was for the purpose of just showing you how, Flex and Grid work. But now that we're actually building, we're imagining we're building a proper page or a proper footer section, and we are using client first, there's certain practices that you want to implement. So within our footer section, we have our secondary class, which is called padding global. Padding global, which comes with the style guide when you copy it over, essentially dictates the left and right spacing of your content. So as we know in Webflow or in any website, sorry, content doesn't automatically stretch to the edge of the page. Even if you look at this site as an example, all the content in the middle has spacing on the left and has spacing on the right. In earlier weeks, I showed you guys how you can add that spacing through padding and through containers. So this is not new information. It's just how you do it is maybe a bit new. So the way in which I do it, or you do it with client first, is that you had this padding global div block, and it automatically has padding sets to 2.5 REM. Another thing that I actually forgot to mention is REM, because that's a different unit of measurement from pixels, which is what we were using before. You can use any unit measurement you want. However, the preferred or the recommended one to use is either REM or EM. So maybe next week we might briefly cover the differences between those and like the sizing differences. But the easiest way to do it right now is to just use a converter. So there's one that I use specifically all the time. And I've been using this for years. So like there's some that I remember like automatically the conversion and then some I don't. So I just use this like, okay, if something's 100 pixels, how many REM is it? It'll tell you and then you can go in and type in that value. But we'll go over this briefly next week, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But I just wanted to mention it because the style guide that we copied, this clonable, uses REM sizing. So I just realized that might be confusing. So it has this set. We can And then once we've done that, the next thing we want to add is padding on the top and on the bottom. Oops. So how we do that with client first is the idea is you have these global utility classes that you then are trying to up. So instead of creating one class that's maybe vertical, padding, vertical, small, which you can do as well, it's easier sometimes to use combo classes and to use more unique names so that you can keep reusing them in your projects. So padding vertical, what does it mean? Well, as the name indicates, it means we are now setting the vertical padding of this div block. So the padding on the top and on the bottom. When you click your class area again, you'll see that, oh, actually, they don't appear, but then you can then choose what sizing you want to use. So there's padding small, there's medium, there's large. If you go through your style guide, you see that they're all there. So let's say I want this to be padding large. Now that I've said this, you'll see that it's applied this padding, 3 rem, 3 rem. So it's given me 3 rem padding on top and 3 rem padding on bottom, which I think is the same as 48 pixels. Yeah, so that's the same as 48 pixels. You notice that it's also added padding on the left and right. Sometimes that's just the Webflow glitch and it doesn't actually, it actually hasn't added that padding anywhere. Add the padding on the top and the bottom, which is what we want. Now, our last layer that we're going to add before we actually start building out our footer is our container. Because we've set the padding that we want using padding global on the left and the right, and we put it to 5%. Super huge screen, for example. Like this on my screen right now looks fine, but maybe on a super large screen, if we had only set 5%, the content would look too stretched out. Like this would be too on the left and this would be too much on the right, and then be a huge gap in the middle. So in order to prevent our content from stretching and to take into account the larger screens, we use containers, and we've covered containers before. Containers just make sure that there's a maximum width for our content. So our content will not exceed this amount. So now we have a container, then we can go in and then start adding our basically our div blocks and our layouts for how we want to build this footer. So with client first style naming, you normally start out with your components. So footer section, footer component, you'll see that they're similar to each other. And then anything else you add in here will follow the same format. So footer, I don't know, header, footer, column. Whatever it is, it'll always start with footer and then underscore and, the name. But like I mentioned, a lot of this is really just partly preference, partly it's according to their guidelines, which is why I advise you to read their guidelines. But you don't have to think too strictly with like, okay, I have to use this, I have to use that. Just think more broadly about how do I name things in a way where it's organized. If somebody else were looking at my project, they'd immediately understand what's going on. And there's a structure. That's the most important thing. There has to be a structure to how you name your layers. It's incredibly important to know how to do that before you even start building anything. So in terms of what footer, I actually don't even have a footer design idea. So I'm gonna go to a website I actually really like to get some inspo. Let me see, what is a simple footer we can build? Well, not too simple. This is footer.design. They have like references of footers that other people have built. It's really good for like design inspo. So I use it a lot. These are all either complicated or too simple. I don't even, let me see. Okay. let me see. Okay, let me go back up here. Okay, let's say we want to build this. This is not bad. Okay, so let's say we're going to build this footer. Great. So first thing is we'll see that our footer is black. So we're going to select our footer section because if we selected this and we made it black, and I actually don't think we even have black saved as a variable, which is fine. It'll only make this component black, but we need the whole section to be black here. So I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna select my section and I'm gonna make that black. Now that we have that set, we have two parts of this footer. We have this top part here and this bottom part here. So a lot of different ways you can go with like building something like this. But because I know I have two sections, like top and bottom, I can immediately give this like flex vertical and maybe I think it has like a big gap. So we'll say I'm very used to REM, so I'm gonna use that, but you don't have to in the beginning. So there'll be 5 REM spacing between the top and the bottom half. And then I add another div, and this is what I'm going to be using to build this top part here. So we'll call that footer top row because it's the top row of our footer. Very, very simple. I'm assuming very simple and easy to understand. Now that I built that, we can see that it's on the right. So there are a couple ways to do this. But for now, let's just add in. So we have our links here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have the copyright here as well. So it seems to be that it's on the right side of our screen. So maybe we want to actually make that 50%. And in alignment, we want to align it on the right because it's on the right side. So now that we've done that, we can go in and add our footer. I'll just call it footer social links. So these are specific, these 4 links here that we want to add. So I'll add in a text link for that. And say this is Instagram. And you'll see now it doesn't have any styling. So this is one of those times where you can go into your HTML tag stylings once you've set them, in your style guide. Or we can say we want a custom styling for this. Like this is a unique styling just for the footer, in which case it makes sense to just create a new style. So we'll just call it footer link. And we'll make the sizing like, this is like 20 pixels. Now you also see that the color is blue. And we want that to be white and we don't want any underline. So this is, links usually are automatically underlined. We don't want that. So we just click that X. Now that I've done that, I'm gonna duplicate it 4 times because we have 4 links here. And then after I select my footer social links, I'm going to turn that into a grid because that's what we want. We want it to be a grid. So I've turned that into a grid and that looks good for now. So these are my social links. If I want to add this little copyright here, that is separate from the social links. So I'm just going to select my top row div here, and I'm going to add in a text block. And this one I'm going to name as 2025. I don't have the copyright symbol, so I'm just not going to bother with it. So I'm just going to say 2025. Now it comes underneath because we didn't actually set any the layout styling for footer top row, so it just puts content on top of each other. But I think the best way to have this on the left and have this on the right is you could do flex and horizontal, and here where it says alignment, you can stretch. Oops, where it says left, you can stretch. So instead of them following one after another from the left, they can be spaced out so they're at the edge. So this is all the way on the left, this is all the way on the right. You can do it that way, or you can even use a grid again. But you notice a grid doesn't give us that spacing unless you manipulate it a bit more. So for now, the easiest thing to do is to just have it look like that. So let me copy these: Facebook, Twitter, and what was the last one? I think LinkedIn. The only thing is that this is dark and hard to see, and according to our reference, it's supposed to be white. So I could make this white. I mean, obviously, like I said, we're learning how to actually build things in Webflow properly. So you would need to then add a class. So you could create a new class like footer, copyright text. Chances are you already have these classes applied in your project once you've copied the style guide. Alternatively, sometimes the best way to apply things throughout something as opposed to individually is to select one of the parent divs. So this is our component, right? And all of our text and content is in here. Let me undo that. So I can go in and I can actually add a color to my component, which will then apply to everything that I've added in here. So you can see it already changed the color of this text. The only time that won't work is, for example, with this link here, we have set a specific color to this link, which means it doesn't matter what color we've set on our parent div, which is this component. As long as we have selected this and actually given it its own unique color, this is the color that will apply. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If we set this to default, oh, sorry, links by default in Webflow will be blue. So you actually have to do set a link to them. Um, so we can just apply color white to our component and that will add the color to anything in here. We can even change the styling so that it will also make sure the styling is fixed for anything we add in here. So let's just do that for now. And then the only other thing I want to do is maybe increase the spacing of our footer top row. So next is to do our footer bottom row, which is now this part here. So this part has two parts. It has this top section and then it has this huge heading. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to first add in my first top layer, which is these three texts here. And then what to call this? Let's just say, oops, it's called footer info. Like, let's just call it that. And we can see that it stretches. So we have one here, one here, one here. You can use grid or you can use flex. Both work in this instance. I'm going to use grid. So I want it to center in the middle. And I want it, if I double click, it'll then automatically space between. So it'll spread out from the left to the right, but the center one will be in the center. Now that I've done that, I'll just copy my text block and I'll add it in here. And then so we have here copyright. Oops. This is called Jarkos. Yeah. And then our second thing is this time. So I don't know. Let me just write the time as it is now. I don't know how many seconds we're at. Okay. Oh, it's like proudly. And then this is how I add emojis using my Mac. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. So let's rename this to, oops, Luxy CZ instead, because that's the point. So now we have our, that set. The only other thing is that this is gray, whereas the other text is white. Remember, we set the white through footer component. So if we want to then change this color, you can go in and you can add in, you can create a class for like text color, like let's say alternate or text color, whatever. Or sometimes to make your life easier, just try and think of like, what's the easiest way to do this? This is gray, which means it's kind of like faded. So maybe they just decrease the opacity. So I'm just going to select footer info and I'm just going to decrease the opacity of these elements. It's probably not how they did it. Or I could actually, instead of doing that, I could just manually go in and give it a new color. So let's do that instead. We'll give it this shade of gray. Now, the last thing what we're going to do is we're going to add in our huge heading here. So let's say we want the headings to be, I'll say Flotsies. And this is H1. But like I mentioned, your headings have to be sequential. So footer is the last section on your page, which means it can't be H1 because you probably already used H1 at the beginning of your page. So this is going to be H2, and I'll cover this in more detail why. But H2 is the first heading in every section. So this is our footer section. Therefore, we start with H2. So this is our H2 heading. And like I said, this is probably a very unique heading style. It's not one that we're using. Like, I don't think they'll use it. Probably they use this huge heading anywhere else on the page. So instead of using like the default heading styles, because then of course that'll change them throughout our project, we're going to create a custom heading for this. So we'll call it footer. We'll say footer brand name instead of heading. So we'll call it footer brand name. Now we can go in, let me center it. So align center, so it's in the middle. And then I want it to be huge. So you'll notice I'm increasing the style, but it's not increasing anywhere else. And that's because we've set a fixed height for our text container. So I covered this in an earlier week, but we can just set that to like 1.1 dash or even 1 dash for this. So that'll automatically adjust our sizing, regardless of how large you make it. So we can make this extremely big, like 20 pixels. Now, if I preview, I can see that this is huge, and this is the color we want, so it's great. But it's not huge enough, right? This way that they have their footer is that it literally stretches until the edge of the screen. So going back to my project, if I'm thinking practically, I'm thinking, okay, um, maybe what I need to do is remove my container because a container is going to limit the extent of the width of your, whatever it is that you are creating. So it's going to be, this is the edge. Our content cannot go past here. If we try to make our text too big, sorry, like if I try to increase this text to like 400 pixels. Yeah, it increases in size, but you'll see it's going off to the right because it has this fixed, it cannot go past this point because of our container. So actually, maybe we don't need a container for this style of footer specifically because it's kind of unique. So we can go in and we can remove and unwrap our container. We go back, now we can see our text has extended a bit more. But what is preventing it from reaching the edge is our global padding. So we want to decrease that to maybe 2% because we're trying to copy how it is here. Like this is like barely any space. So we increase that to 2%. Um, and then that I think is like pretty good. Actually, I think this padding kind of applied. So let's remove that. So now we is what we want. Now we can go in and increase our heading size to get it to be, we want it to reach the edge of the screen, right? So let me say 300 pixels. So if I preview 300 pixels is like pretty good. Editing it, it's looks like it's extending, like it's too long, but when you actually preview it, it's not long enough. And if I imagine like this is a screen size that this preview is on. So you can actually click this and type in to see on a larger screen size, like 2500. So a screen size that is 2500 pixels, like a huge monitor, this is how it would look like. So our text is all the way on the left and the right, but our heading is just in the middle. It doesn't stretch. We want it to stretch. What's the easiest way to do that? If I go back to my project, instead of using pixels or using REM or anything, you can use a unit of measurement, which is called VW. So that's viewport width. And this adjusts sizing according to the viewport width of the user screen. So it looks at the size of the user screen, what's the width of the screen, and it automatically adjusts whatever you apply this unit to take that into account. So if I say, for example, I want this to be 100 viewport width, that means it is going to be 100 viewport width of your screen. So in this case, it's too big because it doesn't work as well for the text. Like we don't need the text to be, for example, if my screen is 2000 pixels, my text cannot be 2000 pixels. That's too huge. But we use this as a unit of measurement because it's easier to, it automatically adjusts itself as you reduce the size of your screen. So I can just go in and make this a bit smaller. Like maybe I wanted to make it like, I don't know, 20, 22, let's say 22. And then we preview and we can see, okay, this is pretty good. So what I like about VW is that as you resize your screen, because you're using the width of the screen, if the width of your screen becomes smaller, the text becomes smaller. So that's what makes it really useful to work around and play around with. So I think actually 20 was actually good. So we're going to leave it as that. We can actually make it maybe a bit more like 23. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Actually 22.5, let's say. So the only other thing that we're going to go do now, let me delete these, is you can see their footer. I think their footer might actually be the full width, the full height, sorry, of the screen. But let's actually open the page to see as we finish things off. If I scroll down, okay, it's actually not, I thought it was like the full, like from top to bottom. It's kind of like on this halfway point. But for the sake of our project and like trying to, play around with different styles, maybe we want our footer to start from this top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. Right now, there's this empty space at the bottom because there's nothing to fill that space. How would we do this? We can increase the rem. So let's say we want to make that 10 or even 15. The more space that you add, the more, visually things align. So we increase the space, we can decrease the space. Like let's say we want it to be, I don't know, 20 pixels. We can see already that's created that difference. So it covers the full screen as we want it to. So that's one way to do it. You can also set a fixed width for it and then change this so that it aligns top to bottom. A lot of different ways to do it, but for make things easier, we'll just increase the gap. You can also um, take into account, for example, people have different screen sizes. Like some people have short screens. So similarly to how we use VW for the font size, which uses the user's screen width, you can also take into account the user's screen height and use VH as a tool. So the shorter their screen is, the shorter their section will be, and then the longer their screen is, the longer their section will be. But for now, we'll just use RAM. So that's how we recreated this simple footer, and also using some conventional layout names so that our footer is also structured properly. So that is it for today. That was a lot of info. So before we finish up, I think we're a bit over time, but that's okay. Do we have any questions?
No question.
No question. Mercy, you have any questions?
No, no, I don't have a question.
Okay, great. So, homework for today. What did I write in my email? It was okay, design a simple landing page. A landing page might be a lot. Unless you really want to, you can do that. Alternatively, what I would say is you can also just design another section of a page. You can design a footer, in which case I'll send the link to this inspo site where you can just look out for a very simple example, or if you want to challenge yourself, you can look for a complicated example. But you can redesign one of these. I think there are like hundreds of options here and categories. So you can look for something relatively simple, like this is not so bad, and try and redesign it in Webflow. Or you can look up there's so many inspo sites you can look at online and design a section. So I'm going to change the homework to just design a section in Webflow. But the key thing that we're now looking at is how do you structure your page? So we went through some basics of client first, like you have your page wrapper. I removed it before, but there was also like the main wrapper. And then you have your section, your padding, your containers. It's important to practice how do you actually use this to build out your sections in Webflow. So that's what you can challenge yourself to do if you have time. And then if you have any questions, you can send me an email or on WhatsApp, or if you want me to review your work, you can also just let me know and I'll review your work. But otherwise, I will also send a link to this specific page so you can check it out if you need to in my email. But thank you guys so much. Let me stop recording.